and your shoulders relaxed. Please join me in Gasho. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namadats, namadats, namadats. So this evening's chant is going to be the Jusei Ge. It's in the PDF, or if you're using the Red Hawaiian book, it is on page 54. 가건 조세간 이시무조도 시간 불만족 세프 조쇼각 가오 무료고 부의大세슈 부사이 쇼빙그 세프 조쇼각 가시 조仏道묘쇼 조지포 극교 미쇼몬 세프 조쇼각 리역 진쇼넨 조에 슈봉교 시금의조도 이쇼텐닌시 진리기 엔다이코 부쇼무사이도 쇼조상크묘 고사이 슈야크난 外非知恵言、滅し根もあん、閉塞小悪道、通達全宗門、高僧上満足、いよろじっぽ、日月修十期、天候恩不言、一種解放像、公正功徳法、上大衆住、説法四く、供養一切仏、具足修徳本、元年出上満、特異三害を、如仏無下知、通達未不詳、願学営利、投資最小尊、志願若国大仙お感動、国書天人、大内妙見、ナマダブ、ナマダブ、ナマダブ、ナマダブ、ナマダブ、ナマダブ、願に真空毒、平等性祭、同発菩提一心、往生安楽。Namadats, namadats, 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 namadats. Well, good evening again, everyone. I hope you enjoyed chanting. It's always good to get our voices going this time of the evening. Today, I would like to reflect on something that happened here at New York. For those that might not be familiar, I'm Reverend Rai. I'm the minister for 3 temples in the Eastern District, for Seabrook, Ekoji, of course, and the New York Buddhist Church. And I actually live at the New York Buddhist Church here in Manhattan. And it can be quite a busy place. We do have people that will come and knock on the door and ask questions. And so I never know exactly what my day is going to have in store for me. And it was one of those days today. And one of the things we have is a very beautiful onaijin, or traditional altar. And for those of you that have been to a Jodo Shinshu temple, or perhaps another school of Buddhism from Japan, we have the traditional onaijin, or altar, where we've got the statue of the Buddha. He's gold and he's in this house. And then there are portraits of our founder on both sides, on our founder, Shinran Shonin and Renyo Shonin, and incense burning. It's quite elaborate. And especially for us that have been involved in the tradition for a while, sometimes we take the iconography or the symbolism for granted. So I knew that I've been working with several people, getting ready for them to come in probably next month to do funeral services. And so one of the women who I've been talking to just knocked on the door unexpectedly. And so I go down and I let her in, and she's a very nice woman. And so she was wanting to set up the service for her deceased brother. However, to make things more complicated is that her brother wanted to have his urn with his parents. And so here at the New York Buddhist Church, and same also at Ekoji, there's what we call an okotsudo. And then okotsudo means is that there is an alcove or a room where the actual urns are placed, and then they're maintained there. And so when we have the Eitaikyo service during the latter part of the year, that is a memory for those that have passed on. So for here, it's at the New York Buddhist Church, it's quite elaborate. So if you see our beautiful altar, there's these huge portraits that are probably about 4 feet wide and about 8 feet tall. And we have to take those down and we have to open the doors. And then there's row upon rows of these urns, which is very meaningful for us because we know that each one of those urns represented a person. And the only time that we have those open is during the Eitaikyo service, which is in November. But this person, we didn't know whether her parents were there or not. So with the busyness of going on, she was very apologetic. And she says, you know, Reverend Ryan, I'm sorry. She says, I'm not Buddhist. I hope this is okay. And I will, of course, the service is for your brother. And she says, I'm not a very spiritual person. And she was very apologetic about it. And I said, no, this is okay. This is for your brother and for your family. So our maintenance person had to go up and look at all the different names. And we finally found her parents, which had passed over 50 years ago. And so then they closed back up the Onaijin, and there was his ashes, and then we lit it up traditional style, and it was absolutely beautiful. And for me, for the first time, you know, like I said, I see it every day, but it was so peaceful and calming. And even though she doesn't identify as Buddhist, she was sitting there and she says, "This is so beautiful. I'm so glad that my brother is going to be resting here." And um, so it was interesting. Another one of the things that's very unusual for those that are at our temples, and I see we've got somebody from Seabrook, is that here we actually have a skylight over the Onaijin that has a special filter on it. So that means that when the daylight comes in, it doesn't damage the filter. But like in Japan, you get to see the altar lit up at any time during the day, and you get to see all the nuances. For those that are maybe new, or this is one of your first services, what you see behind me is a Buddhist shrine. We call this the Obutsudan. And actually, the components are exactly of what a temple's or altar would be like. And so it's hard to see, but there's the statue of Amida Buddha, and then we have all the symbolism. The people from Ekoji are probably smiling because this is not what the Onaijin looks like at Ekoji, and we can talk about that later, why the Onaijin doesn't look like that at Ekoji. And so she was talking to me, and she was a very nice woman. And so she said to me, she says, because when we closed everything up, the light naturally illuminated on the statue of Amida Buddha. And so she says, oh, it's so beautiful. She says, how would you feel? What would you do if something happened to the statue? And I thought that was a very interesting question on one way. Obviously, there's one where there's the practical aspect, but I think she was talking more from a spiritual concept. How would you feel if something happened to the statue? And that's what I would like us to talk about tonight, because I have experienced that. Actually, the Ekoji Sangha has experienced that happening. I was the resident minister at Ekoji 10 years ago, and then got transferred to California. But I was there for 2.5, 3 years. And if you go to Ekoji right now, the altar is quite beautiful, but there is no statue in the main altar area. There is what we call the myogo, or which is a scroll with the 6 characters that say Namo Amida Butsu. And the simple translation is I take refuge in Amida Buddha. And what I'd like to say tonight is that, so I said there's no Buddha statue in the Onaijin at Ekoji, but there was, when Ekoji first opened, Reverend Suji commissioned a statue and had it placed in the Onaijin. And for various reasons that I don't need to go into here, it was decided that they would replace the statue with the Myogo. Now, one of the words, I know we don't need to understand a lot of Japanese words, but honzan is a word that means the object of reverence. So, for example, in your home, you might have a piece of Buddhist art. It might be a Bodhisattva statue. It might be a statue of the Buddha, but that is not the main object of reverence. And so at Ekoji, the statue was placed into the lobby, and again, it was not the object of reverence, but obviously you respect the statue. So people would come in and it was quite a beautiful piece of artwork, almost life size. And you'd walk around the statue and then you go into the hondo. And so I remember very clearly, for some reason, maybe Eric or some of the other long-term members will remember why we were having an event in the evening. And this statue was hand-carved, made out of wood. And we come into, we open up, unlock the front door and we go in, and there the statue is down on the ground, broken. And all of us did this gasp. And fortunately, I'd like to point out that there wasn't major damage to the statue. So for those that remember the statue is like many Buddhist statues, he's standing on a pedestal of lotus leaves, right? Lotus petals, excuse me. And so what happened is that he spun around and fell down and broke his hand off. And there was damage to his other fingers, but he was intact. And so for me, as even though I was the minister, the idea of that here we are with the statue of the Buddha on the floor, what do we do? And we had a very quick discussion. It was a very passionate discussion with the Ekoji members. And even though this was not the object of reverence, meaning that it was not in the main altar, you have to respectfully treat it properly. So what we did, and I see we've got some long, yes, there is, thank you. Are you in Hawaii still? The Nakamuras, they're long-term members. They remember this day very well, I'm sure. And so what we decided to do is the tradition is that we took the statue, we wrapped it in, and I'm using the word it because as we know, Amida Buddha is not male or female. It goes beyond gender. It goes beyond race. It's the idea of enlightenment itself. So when I say it, it's not being disrespectful. So we took the statue, wrapped it in a white cloth and put it into a box. And we tried to figure out how we could repair it. And unfortunately, 10 years later, that's where it still remains. And hopefully I've talked to, not to get off the subject, but I have spoken to Reverend Fujimoto, who's an artist, and there is probably a way that we could fix the hand. But anyway, so the idea that we had at that time and currently going on at Ekoji, because when I visited last time, we had people that didn't know what the statue was in the box, and some of the youth was sitting on the box, and I had to say, please don't sit on the box. There's somebody in there, okay? But again, getting back to this idea of, what is the idea of the Dharma or the Buddhist teachings? Is it the statue? Is the statue sacred? And this will be answered differently from different schools of Buddhism. So for example, I was explaining the myogo or the calligraphy that has the name Namo Amida Butsu. That is considered in our denomination one of the three desired things to have in the Onaiji. So Renyo Shonin, who was our master over 500 years ago, said that the most preferable would be the myogo, which is the writing, and I'll tell you why. The second most desirable is a scroll of a painting of Amida Buddha. And then the third one that is acceptable is the statue of the Buddha. So then guess which one most of the temples in the world have? They have the statue. And we can talk about, and when we have the discussion group, I love to hear your viewpoints because, the iconography or the nonverbal, non-intellectual interaction that we have with art is called religious art. I know that when I went to Italy many, many years ago, as a Buddhist, I appreciated all the beautiful Catholic art, the pictures of the Mother Mary. It was very moving to me, even though I was not a Christian. And so the Buddhists, the Jodo Shinshu members have known for years that dynamic of the statue does create this connection. And to give a plug for the Kalavinka, our newsletter is being edited as we speak and will be out probably next week. I wrote an article on about how somebody that everybody thought wasn't appreciating what was going on at the temple. It was very meaningful for this person at a deep level. She just did not express it verbally. And that is what the Buddhist art does, or the iconography or the statues do, is that they invoke a feeling that you might not get going to just the service or hearing a sermon or a Dharma talk. And I know that for me myself, I know that I just saw Eric Ishii come on. So when you go to Japan and you go on these study tours, you go to all these different temples and you see all these different statues, and so you have this different feeling. So every time you go into it, the idea is that you are connecting to the Dharma. I remember one time I was there with a bunch of other members from BCA, and we were sitting on the temple steps, and the monk came out in broken English, says, "Buddha's house, don't sit on steps. No, 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 don't sit on the Buddha steps." So here's one example. So we know that the Buddha statue is not a real living being, and it is a piece of wood, but then we want to respect what it represents. Um, I think one of the funniest Zen stories, because Zen stories often are quite humorous, is that there's the story of this monk that was wandering through, in the mid 1500s, and he comes across an abandoned temple. And so he's going, it's a rainy day and he's cold, and he goes in there and there's nobody around. And so he decides that he wants to warm himself up. And so what he does is he goes and takes the statue of the Buddha off, puts him on the ground and lights him on fire. And so then he's standing there heating himself. And not to be too graphic, but the Zen stories are really funny. He's warming his bun, actually. His bum is what he's warming. And so in comes the local villagers and they go, oh my gosh, what in the world are you doing? And he says, well, I'm trying to get warm, but I'm also trying to release the Buddhist element. So if you know the story of the Buddha, there's relics supposedly of the Buddha, his teeth and his hair and everything. And so he says, I'm trying to free the Buddhist relics from the statue. And they go, oh, well, it's not in that Buddhist statue. So he looked at the other two statues that were standing there. There's Bodhisattva. He says, let's burn them as well. Then maybe they're in there. And they're like, no, 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 you don't understand. And so what he was that the parable of the story in the Zen community is that, yes, they are simply pieces of wood. And then the idea is that he, is saying, are you really thinking that this is a live thing? And in going even further, not saying is it a live person, but are there relics in there of the Buddha, taking it a little bit of a different direction? When I was at Seattle, that was in the year 2000. I don't know, many of you remember, there's been so much international news that's happened over the years, but do you remember when they destroyed the Buddha statues in Afghanistan? They were the largest standing Buddha statues in the world, over 900 feet tall, several thousand years old, and the Taliban just destroyed them. And I remember at that time, Reverend Castro, the minister of Seattle, we had a discussion about it. How do you feel? And all of my non-Buddhist friends were very upset. And I said, of course, I do not want the statues destroyed, but it's the perfect example of impermanence, that nothing lasts forever. I don't think they appreciated or quite understood what I was trying to get at. But the idea is that the statues were destroyed. And I understand now that they're talking about trying to replicate them in some way to bring back the cultural heritage. Because for those that aren't familiar, Afghanistan was, believe it or not, was a Buddhist country centuries and centuries ago. And so a lot of very unusual Buddhist art comes from that era. So if you ever see a statue where the Shakyamuni Buddha appears Caucasian almost and has flowing robes like you would see in a Greek statue, that is from that influence of the Afghanistan region. And if anybody has the chance to go to Seattle, they have one of those statues as well, a bodhisattva sitting in the lotus position with the very unusual characteristics of more of a Greek style sculpture with the robes flowing. So getting back to the idea, the statue today, the woman that came that was worrying about the service for her loved one, not having her parents were strong members of the temple, but have been gone for many years. So her connection was cultural or by her parents, and her brother was still active. But even that, she could see the statue, and there was dialogue that came out from her about what the statue was, what was the meaning of. And then she asked me, interestingly enough, because she didn't want to ask me anything about the spiritual part of her brother's memorial service. And then she says, by the way, what are you going to talk about in the service? What's the Buddhist thing? What are you going to talk about? So I thought it was a great example of someone coming in and kind of letting their guard down, seeing the statue of how beautiful it was. And it was very beautiful. Like I said, it was almost like a movie, because there's the statue illuminated by the natural sun coming in from the skylight. And then her brother's urn was there, and he was illuminated too. And so that's when she asked, and I pointed out that the service was for the memory of her loved one, and that people that will be attending will be saying goodbye to their loved one in this physical world, but not in the realm of nirvana. So again, I think what I'd like us to think about tonight, and the discussion should be great because we've got some of the Ekoji people that remembered the statue and what happened when it went down, and some of the other ideals, like for example, with Afghanistan. And then for those, Joe's not here tonight for personal reasons. He's from Seattle as well, and they recently had a fire. And so the idea of like, what is the damage done to the temple? What is the significance of that? But I'd like to finish with one other parable, which I think is really wonderful. I'm talking about, oh, is it the statue, is it the form, or is it the Buddhist teachings, the Dharma, that is the most important part? And this parable takes place in India. And there was a monk that was going along and going through the forest, and he comes to a river, and he needs to get to the other side to go to where he's going. And he looks up and down. He walks a few miles or kilometers both ways. There's no bridge to cross, and it's too wide for him to swim across. So how am I going to get across, he thinks. And then he looks and he says, well, I'm right here in a jungle. So what he does is he cuts down some trees, and he starts to get really creative, and he's thinking, oh, well, maybe I can tie it together, with some vines. And he's really getting involved in making this raft. It's not just like sitting on a log and going across. He made a raft. So then he gets on the raft, and very importantly, when the monks would travel in historical times, a lot of times they would have a basket or a backpack or a knapsack with the sutras, the holy texts. And so the whole point was not his safety or whether he was going to be wet or dry. He was protecting the Buddhist sutras. That was his main concern about getting across the river. So what he does is that he gets in the raft and he goes across, and it's relatively uneventful, and he gets to the other side, and he puts his knapsack down with the sutras on a rock, because the sutras are not supposed to be on the ground. They're supposed to be respected. He pulls out the raft, and he looks at the raft, and he goes, oh, should I leave the raft here? He goes, well, I put a lot of work into this raft. It's a pretty clever design. Look at this. I zigzagged this, and it came across, and maybe I'll be able to use this again. And so the idea is that the raft represents what we would call upaya, or the ways of Buddhist teachings. So for us, it's like, whether we go and pray in front of the statue, whether we study books, or whether we chant, the whole idea is to reach nirvana or enlightenment. And symbolically, he was on the other shore, so symbolically he had reached nirvana, but he was still wanting to hold on to what we would say probably in our contemporary world is his baggage. But for him, it was this raft. It's like, oh, this beautiful teaching. And again, getting to other schools of Buddhism, and ours included, sometimes our following the Buddhist teachings can be an attachment in itself, that we have reached the other shore. Or for us in Jodo Shinshu, maybe we have a touch of what we call shinjin, or entrusting. But we're like holding on to that raft, we're holding on chanting the right way, or we're holding on studying to the books. So in the discussion of, the idea of the teachings of the Buddha is a way for us to go to the other shore to reach nirvana, but the teachings themselves are not the end in themselves. So I hope that parable at the end here about the story of the raft, that we go across and we want to continue to carry. And so we can have a discussion right now, or if you want to, about, how much of the institutional part of Buddhism is a raft, but that's up to our conversation here. So what I'd like to do is I would like to conclude with a reading. So tonight we are going to be reading the Creed number 2, which is on, I keep scrolling too much here, I'm getting dizzy. Page 6, please. The Shinshu Pledge number 2. Entrusting in the vow of the Buddha and reciting the sacred name, I shall proceed through the journey of life with strength and joy. Revering the light of the Buddha and reflecting upon my imperfect self, I shall strive to live a life of gratitude. Following the teachings of the Buddha and discerning the right path, I shall spread the true Dharma. Rejoicing in the compassion of the Buddha, respecting and aiding others, I shall do my best to work towards the welfare of society. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. And just before we go into the discussion, I'd like us to do another very short silent meditation. So if you could please join me by sitting up erect and relaxing your shoulders. Please join me in Gasho. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namadats, namadats.